introducing Deborah Thomas today. I'm Lee Kabatinian. I'm an assistant professor in criminology, law, and society. And so I see a lot of CLS folks here and a lot of anthro folks here, and so I'm really glad this all came together so nicely. So Deborah Thomas has a lot on her bio to share, and so for those of you who were at the earlier workshop, I kind of focused more on her methodological, ethnographic, and multimodal approaches to research, and so for this introduction, I thought I would highlight more of her kind of traditional written work in anthropology. Dr. Thomas is the R. Jean Brownlee Term Professor of Anthropology in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Pennsylvania. She is also a core faculty member in Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies and holds a secondary appointment with the Graduate School of Education. She is also a member of the graduate groups in English, Africana Studies, and the School of Social Policy and Practice. Like I said, I'll say a little bit more about her traditional kind of written ethnographies today. And that, as I mentioned in the earlier workshop on multimodal research, I said a little bit more about her other types of work that she's done. But from her writing, and I can attest that it is beautifully written, engaging, thoughtfully critical, and deeply theoretical. And she has written 2 single-authored books, Modern Blackness, Nationalism, Globalization, and the Politics of Culture in Jamaica, which was published in 2004, and Exceptional Violence, Embodied Citizenship in Transnational Jamaica in 2011. And she has forthcoming a book called The Political Life in the Wake of the Plantation, Entanglement, Witnessing, and Repair, which I expect we'll probably hear a little bit about today. And also a co-edited volume has already been published in 2006 called Globalization and Race, Transformation in the Cultural Production of Blackness. So in addition to these 3 books, Dr. Thomas has published numerous articles, far too many to mention, in top peer-reviewed journals. And this impressive body of work is largely based on her long-term ethnographic and multimodal research in Jamaica with Jamaican people, politics, violence, nationhood, sovereignty, and blackness, topics which she weaves together and kind of elucidates the integral bits of these things in her written work and in her multimodal research productions. And speaking of this whole idea of multimodality, I would be remiss if I didn't mention her long-term dedication to pushing the boundaries of this traditional ethnographic work that we often do of just writing. And this dedication shows up in her production of films, one of which we got to see earlier today, her curation of museum exhibits, and her development of a new kind of renamed section in American Anthropologist called Multimodal Anthropologies. And she is currently the editor-in-chief of American Anthropologist. And one final note, in sort of the tradition of CLS, where we like to share a sort of non-academic aspect, we learned earlier that Deborah Thomas's former career was that of a professional dancer in New York with a group called I looked it up, Urban Bush Women. So without further ado, I turn the floor over to anthropologist, ethnographer, filmmaker, writer, and dancer, Deborah Thomas, and her talk called Political Life in the Wake of the Plantation, Sovereignty, Witnessing, and Repair.
Thank you. It's so funny because when I told my family I was going to be a dancer, my mother's family was like, they're going to pay you to dance in bars? It was like, stages, concert dance. Like, oh, right. So thank you for that introduction, and thank you to Brian and Lee and everybody else who's been involved in the visit. I've really enjoyed spending time with many of you today. And it's been, I think, a really interesting sort of set of exchanges. It's definitely energized me, and so I've really appreciated the invitation and the time and the weather. So today I am, in fact, going to share work from the book that I'm just finishing up. I'm going to give you a sense of the theoretical frame first in relation to sovereignty and affect and witnessing. Then I'm going to give you some of the historical context for using this frame in Jamaica. Then I am also going to share with you some of the visual archives We've been creating, assembling, and juxtaposing, but I'm not going to talk about them. So we could talk about it in the Q&A if you want, and I'm interested in how you receive them in relation to, what I'll be talking about. And then at the end, I'm going to return to the bigger questions about social change and revolution that really generated the kind of frame that I want to use. So the key question for me has been, what does it mean to be human politically in the wake of the plantation? How have people confronted the unpredictable afterlives of colonialism and slavery, nationalism and state formation in ways that perform not only a material but also an affective transformation? What does sovereignty feel like? These questions are questions that have been haunting me over the past 12 years or so, during which I've been developing archives of the relationship between sovereignty and violence in Jamaica. My specific obsessions have had to do with the temporal regimes to which post-colonial sovereignty projects have been tethered, to how these have conditioned the affective states through which they're enacted and experienced, and how these have shaped the complex relationships between sovereignty and subjectivity within a context whose foundational infrastructures were imperialism, colonization, and plantation-based slavery. I've been interested in what Sylvia Wynter identified as a constitutive tension between the dominant logic of the plantation and its internal threat, the often millennial spaces within which enslaved persons maintained a conception of themselves as human rather than as property. It is this tension that would ultimately shape the relationship between the national and the popular in struggles over sovereignty. And it's this tension that becomes legible by attending to moments of exceptional violence and to the realm of everyday practice. My current project, which is a collaboration between psychologist Deanne Bell, musician and composer Junior Gabu Wedderburn, and myself, concerns the so-called Tivoli incursion in West Kingston, Jamaica in 2010, during which members of the police force and the Jamaican army attempted to apprehend Christopher Dudus Coke, who had been ordered for extradition to stand trial in the United States on gun and drug running charges. And in the process of trying to find him, they killed at least 75 civilians. The project aims to bear witness to these dynamics regarding subjectivity, violence, and governance in the kind of quiet and quotidian way that Tina Kampt has identified as a modality of refusal. A, quote, nimble and strategic practice that undermines the categories of the dominant, unquote. Witnessing, as implied here, is neither straightforward nor unmediated. Rather, it's ambivalent and relationally complex. So our agenda has been to juxtapose assemblages of archives, visual, oral historical, colonial, and post-colonial, in order to think through the relations they bring into being among the psychic, material, prophetic, and political dimensions of sovereignty. The broader historical and geopolitical entanglements these relations make visible, and the possibilities they generate for a redefinition of human recognition. The form of witnessing that interests me, one that I'm calling Witnessing 2.0, is not the witnessing of human rights organizations or of public tribunals like Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, which are limited in and through their relationships to the categories through which they're mobilized, like human rights and reconciliation. Witnessing 2.0 is instead closer to the form of bearing witness described by Barbie Zalazar, in which witnessing is a moral practice that involves assuming responsibility for contemporary events. This is what Sue Tate has referred to as bearing witness, distinguishing it from eyewitnessing, by emphasizing its affective dimensions beyond visuality. Tate argues that, quote, bearing witness exceeds seeing, and this excess lies in what it means to perform responsibility, which is what Avery Gordon has referred to as responsibility, right? The ability to respond. By focusing on the extent to which one recognizes the various ways that we're implicated in the processes we address, Witnessing 2.0 is the kind of co-performative witnessing for which Dwight Conkergood, a performance studies scholar, consistently advocated. A commitment to bodies on the line, soundscapes of power, dialogic interanimation, political action, and matters of the heart, end quote. Witnessing 2.0 emerges through the development of affective archives in order to reveal the ways we maintain the conjunctures of power in which we live, as well as how the technologies through which we witness potentially exceed these conjunctures. It therefore offers us windows into what Benjamin called the tiny spark of contingency that might produce something unexpected and that might redefine the human outside of modernist binaries. Witnessing 2.0 thus makes visible how affects operate in multiple temporalities and across levels of consciousness. It is a practice of recognition and love that destabilize the boundaries between self and other, knowing and feeling, complicity and accountability, and one that potentially reformulates the ground of the human itself. New World plantations, it has been extensively argued, provided the basis for modern social and economic arrangements in the Western Hemisphere and beyond. Contemporary claims and complaints regarding humanness in the Caribbean are therefore being made within a modernity generated through the movement of Europe, with Africa conscripted, toward the Americas, and the establishment of new forms of genocidal violence as the basis for a changing transnational capitalist political economy. Mercantilism inaugurated material, religious, political, philosophical, scientific, and ideological processes that indelibly linked the New World with the Old in a common project of divining modern humanity in racial terms. The settling of the New World also saw the twin transformative processes of racial fixing of various groups of Africans into Negros and various groups of indigenous populations into Indios, and also racial flexibility, the various configurations of creolization, transculturation, hybridity that emerged. These were processes that became institutionalized through particular extractive labor regimes and constellations of citizenship that excluded non-European groups. The initial racialized elaborations of what it meant to be human would subsequently be mobilized to serve late 19th century projects of indirect imperial rule throughout Africa and South Asia, as well as the emergent imperialist project of the United States. Anti-colonial and nationalist projects sought to interrogate, critique, and ultimately revise these originary delineations of the relationships between personhood, value, and political legibility through the development of new forms of community cultural consciousness, if not always substantially new economic arrangements. Indeed, the elaboration of continuities between imperial and nationalist modes of governance has been a critical focus for scholars of empire across the disciplines, including attention, in the case of New World societies, to the ongoing forms of violence that have been enacted against Black bodies. Modern liberal democratic political arrangements have been designed to hide these ontological processes. They have disguised the dehumanization of foundational racism through the conceptual framework of perfectibility. Many anthropologists have argued as much, and while these oftentimes brilliant analyses have yielded trenchant critiques of the diverse vectors of subjectification, I've also felt that they've sometimes stopped just short of the more sensory dimensions of sovereignty and have therefore left us unable to answer other also pertinent questions. And this is in part because much of this work, inspired by Foucault and Agamben, often fails to take into account what Alex Wahelier called racializing assemblages, how they're foundational rather than incidental to modern delineations of humans, not quite humans, and non-humans. What analyses of bare life seem to disavow is that race always prefigures notions of what it means to be a human and potentially a citizen, and thus also what it feels like to be a problem, especially once political normativity is marked by liberal rights-oriented participatory democracy. This forces a return to my original question. Within this context, What has it meant to be a human capable of acting politically in and on the world? If we agree that sovereignty is best understood as a dynamic practice and that therefore there's no static or unitary constellation to which it refers, then we must think of it as performed and thus embodied, as constituted from below as much as from above. As performance, sovereignty is also a mode of address, and thus requires acknowledgement from an audience for whom the performance must be legible. If all social projects that are not forcefully imposed must be, quote, affective in order to be effective, as Will Mazzarella has argued, then our ethnographic attention must be attuned to the production, reception, and circulation of these affective fields. Focusing ethnographically on the relation between affect and sovereignty offers a number of important affordances, the first of which has to do with the emergence of the body on the stage of critical thinking, not just as the raw material of governance, but also as a way of knowing, both politically and intimately. This body is not private, but is instead social, relational, and historical, and its unconscious, therefore, is also fully historical and historically and culturally situated. Exploring the constitution of the political subject not primarily through nationalism, nor through state or even extra-state-driven processes of subjectification, but through the cultivation of embodied affects that are shaped by the particular temporal conjunctures in which they emerge, enables us to interrogate the ways political affects can transcend the context of their emergence, allowing them to appear and resurface unpredictably. It can thus unbind sovereignty not only from territory, and therefore from the political centrality of the nation-state, but also from the teleologies of linear progressive time. What an affective approach to sovereignty gives us then is a better sense of what Danilin Rutherford has called the atmospherics of an age, of the non-ideological dimensions of hailing and the aspects of relation that arrive without explicitly calling attention to themselves, creating a sensibility of community that disturbs both the spatial and temporal dimensions of the nation-state through the particular forms of mediation that bring them into being. These atmospherics are grounded in particular historical materialities, they are generated through particular technologies, and they produce temporally specific expressions with different effects in different periods. So in thinking through how the Tivoli incursion came to be possible, how the conditions could have been created in which it would be thinkable that the military forces of the state could kill so many civilians with relative impunity, we have been cultivating an archive of affect. And this is Gail Wald's term, one that she mobilizes to understand the role of the late 60s, early 70s television variety show Soul, as both reflecting contemporary realities and embodying dreams for a Black is beautiful kind of future. Archiving here is not oriented toward the past and its preservation, but is instead intended to elaborate new possibilities for social and political relations, relations that, in the case Wald investigates, are generated through popular cultural expression, but that we have explored through collecting images, sounds, and narratives of state violence. Nadia Ellis has called this elaboration of possibility improvisation, an embodied affective register through which African diasporic people enact survival under conditions of unpredictability and multiple forms of sovereign violence. An archive of affect is not quite a counter-archive, or perhaps it would be more accurate to suggest that it's not beholden to the nationalist and masculinist discursive frames that often contextualize counter-archives. Those documentation processes and social movements that have taken the space of the nation-state as their primary mobilizing rubric have accomplished many critical goals, but have ultimately failed to reorient our conceptualization of the social and historical processes outside the domain of the cultural, and our visions of the political outside the space of the liberal. So hence the persistence of the cultures of poverty or cultures of violence tropes and the patterns of exclusion that characterize the colonial period. An archive of affect instead opens a space of potentiality, one that might catalyze new possibilities for seeing connections previously unexamined and for reordering our ontological taken for granted, like time and space, politics and justice, and the very terrain of humanism itself. In making this argument, I'm not suggesting that there's some romantic, miraculous sphere of political action outside of significatory processes and machineries, but instead I am suggesting that the unpredictability of affect and subsequently its power lies in its simultaneous operation at the cognitive mediated level and at a more visceral level. We constitute ourselves through political action in the everyday, both at the level of consciousness and at the level of embodiment. Assembling archives of affect, then, should tell us something about how the sphere of the political has been imagined and felt at various junctures, and about the kinds of politics that are possible at these junctures. It can help us to respond to the forms of racism that produce the ideological terrain of the post-contact New World, but also encourage us to renew, revive, reconstruct, and represent our histories in order to rethink our present. Archives of affect, because they are nonlinear and thus unobligated to the teleologies of liberalism, can also shift the politics of reparations away from discretely local and legally verifiable events and toward the long and slow processes undermining our ability to forge social and political community together. They can urge us to be more skeptical about nationalist narratives of perfectibility, whereby we triumph over past prejudices and injustices through a force of will and commitment to moral right, and instead encourage us to train our vision more pointedly to transnational geopolitical spheres and to the messiness of sovereignty at different moments. At the same time, by inspiring us to see and hear differently, archives of affect can help us to focus on the everyday ways people innovate life without constantly projecting today's struggle into a future redemption. And because they are, in the end, technologies of deep recognition, they can cultivate a sense of mutuality that not only exposes complicity, but also demands collective accountability. My launching pad for these explorations is, of course, the Caribbean, and specifically Jamaica, where the pressing questions always seem to come back in one way or another to how this society came to be so saturated with violence and how to end it. In the Caribbean, the history of plantation development and the transatlantic slave trade has meant that there's been no straightforward relationship between territoriality, nativeness, and nationalist governance. Moreover, in Jamaica, as elsewhere in the British West Indies, the reckoning of land rights, norms regarding the organization of political authority, and conflicts among subgroups developed not in relation to originary land use, but in relationship to a context, at least prior to the 19th century, in which the planter class wielded considerable political influence within parliament and absolute authority locally, and in which indigenous peoples have been conceptually disappeared. In Orlando Patterson's classic text, The Sociology of Slavery, he argued that the primary characteristic of Jamaican slave society was absenteeism. This element was central to the whole social order, he wrote, and was in some way related to almost every other aspect of the society. For Patterson, the consequences of absenteeism were legion. It evacuated Jamaican society of potential leaders within all sectors, and therefore resulted in a legislative council populated by individuals whose, quote, poverty and inefficiency was a matter of public notoriety, who had, quote, no respect and no influence, and who therefore severely diminished the character and efficacy of public office. It prevented the development of a proper educational system, which meant that even planters and their children, save the wealthiest, remained semi-literate. And it, quote, led to a complete breakdown of religion and morality among the resident whites, end quote, with clergymen themselves among the most profligate, which occasioned a breakdown of the institutions of marriage and the family. Most of all, absenteeism meant that the majority of estate profits were repatriated to England rather than reinvested locally, which was, quote, disastrous for an economy so heavily dependent on foreign supplies, end quote. Absenteeism thus produced a loosely integrated society within which there were no significant institutions to create or reinforce laws. Furthermore, Patterson points out, for more than 125 years after initial British colonization of the island, there were no comprehensive slave codes, and despite the passage of a Slave Act in 1696, the relationships between masters and slaves were governed by custom rather than laws. This meant that while masters typically enjoyed absolute legal power, slaves were also able to extract certain rights, most importantly in relation to the cultivation of provision grounds, which became a much more expansive practice than that which had been originally legislated by both the Slave Acts of 1696 and 1788. While these grounds have typically been understood as essential to the production of foodstuffs to sell in the market and therefore to the attainment of cash, which is an irony that property can hold property, and while they were crucial for the development and maintenance of religious and social practices outside the reach of the plantation, customary stewardship of provision grounds also, quote, weakened slave resistance to white power, end quote. And this is Trevor Bernard, right? Bernard reminds us, on the one hand, the tendency of slaves to engage in capitalist market-oriented activity worked in the long run against the logic of plantation slavery because it reduced the slave's dependence on the bounty of the master and thus reduced his control over them. On the other hand, private property and market exchange fractured slave communities. Disputes over property and property-related crimes opened fissures within the slave ranks. Confronting attacks on slave property rights from outside often healed these fissures, but it also often weakened the Black community as a whole, end quote. Making this relation between autonomy and co-optation even more complex is Bernard's assertion that whites, as estate owners, managers, and overseers, were slaves' only protection against the predial larceny of other slaves. As a result, potential solidarities were further strained, and this is Bernard again. When a thief was from within a slave community, slaves could humiliate or ostracize the violator of group norms. But when a thief came from outside the closed society of the plantation, slaves had little option other than to turn to their masters, who alone had recourse to the law and the authority to apprehend and punish slaves wherever they came from, end quote. Whites here embodied the law, and slaves, as property, had no inherent rights unto themselves, and therefore any legal action on their behalf had to be undertaken by their masters. Slaves, on the other hand, entered into competitive arrangements with other slaves as custodians of property. Though they developed collective interests in the preservation of their economic and arguably sociocultural resources, this community solidarity was limited and territorially defined, and the customary agreements masters entered into with slaves ensured the smooth functioning of the plantation system. I've argued elsewhere that we could read in these dynamics the beginnings of a system of patronage and clientelism, albeit an unstable one, in which political authority is not only racialized, but also tied to territorially rooted patterns of protection that ultimately encouraged alliances between the powerful and those they exploited, and undermined alliances between the exploited themselves. In an interview with David Scott, Orlando Patterson made a similar claim, arguing, quote, there's a clear pattern of continuity between the instability of slavery and the plantation belt that sometimes permeated the peasant area and then fed right into the urban slums, end quote. Indeed, patron clientelism would become the defining characteristic of a political system that features what have come to be known in the contemporary period as garrison communities. In Jamaica, thus, a nexus of customary rights related to land use, inheritability, and forms of patronage and clientelistic loyalty forged the ground upon which and mechanisms through which nationalist citizenship claims developed in the 20th century. So what I want to highlight here is that just as the plantation was foundational to modern economic production and labor organization, it was this phenomenon that also shaped the infrastructures, practices, and processes of politics within post-colonial societies in the New World. In Jamaica, the political economy of modern citizenship was, by the mid-20th century, defined through participation in the trade union movement. This broad movement ultimately became politicized by the formation of oppositional political parties, the People's National Party and the Jamaica Labor Party, each connected to a union, initially the Trades Union Congress and after 1943, and ultimately the National Workers Union after 1952, and the Bustamante Industrial Trade Union, B2, respectively. From the earliest moments, conflicts between unions were also conflicts regarding the politicization of territory, especially in downtown Kingston, and these conflicts were violent. In response to a question from political scientist, activist, and politician Trevor Monroe regarding street fighting during union conflicts in the 1940s, Richard Hart, a much celebrated leftist political organizer, remembered that, quote, whole streets changed the composition of tenants living in a particular area, because if you were a P&P man, you couldn't live in certain areas. He explained you had P&P yards and JLP yards, and you had P&P streets and JLP streets developing. And only then, when the forces had reached that level, did the state, in classic Engelsian terms, intervene to preserve the peace between the contending factions. Since power in this context was personalized, ultimately grounded within the charisma and patronage of one or another leader, allegiances to union leaders, and therefore to political parties, were generally understood to be transmitted through the family, the community, and the workplace. This solidified divisions within the working class, but clientelistic networks were not limited to those operating within the domains of organized political structures, but also included those within the fields of education, journalism, business, and community development who could trade information, skills, and contacts with their counterparts in politics. The hegemony of colonial class relations and patterns of leadership was thus secured in such a way that working class Jamaicans would, quote, continue support of a basically middle class political order long after this support would have appeared unjustified on any calculation of social returns. Beginning with universal suffrage in 1944 and culminating in independence in 1962, as government power grew, it became more centralized, which further eroded the ability of working class people to make decisions that would improve their political, economic, and social circumstances, even at the level of local government. This situation was exacerbated by an intensification of partisanship in the distribution of state resources. While this became a feature of politics in the 1940s, it only became institutionalized with respect to labor by the 1950s and housing in the 1960s. The distribution of seasonal farm work tickets, for example, was by 1955 known to operate on a partisan basis. Consider the example, documented again by Trevor Monroe, of a woman who registered for a job with the Government Employment Bureau and was asked what constituency she lived in. And this is the woman. I was told that I would have to be a member of some PNP group before they would find me a job. To make sure I wouldn't lie to them, they told me to get a note from the chairman of whatever group I joined. That this was party policy is evident from the 1959 People's National Party Group Leaders Training Course pamphlet Monroe cites, which laid out the following policy. See that PNP people get work. Of every 10, make it 6 PNP and 4 JLP. And PNP hardcore workers should be provided for. By 1966, when the Jamaica Labor Party was in power and when some factions of U.S. labor were pressuring the American government to shut down the farm work program, this kind of partisanship related to unemployment continued in the guise of assisting farm workers vis-a-vis U.S. unions. In a letter from Michael Manley, then island supervisor and first vice president to the NWU, to his father, Norman Manley, who was then the leader of the opposition, he explained that, quote, their great friend in the American labor movement called Nick Zonerick, who worked with U.S. Steel, and he actually plays a big role in sort of intervening in the labor movement after 1952 in Jamaica. Anyway, their great friend, Nick, had advised him that he convinced the U.S. unions to organize West Indian farm workers rather than advocating for their removal. As a result, the younger Manley proposed that representatives from the NWU meet PNP recommended farm workers before they departed for the United States in order to, quote, put them in a frame of mind to expect to be organized by representatives of the American trade union movement. He added that the NWU and the PNP executive agreed that their policy was to cooperate with the AFL-CIO and that they did not, quote, wish to include the Ministry of Labor and the other trade union in such an exercise, but would prefer to help through the efforts of the NWU. This correspondence shows that political partisanship in Jamaica also took on a transnational dimension and was entangled with foreign institutional bodies. Of course, this has been true not only in relation to labor organizing, but also with respect to the organization of Jamaica's involvement in the international trades in drugs and arms, which, though a feature of political struggles during the 1960s, emerged more strongly in the 1970s and 1980s. By the 1967 elections, in terms of housing and jobs, patronage was explicitly wielded as a political weapon. With continued patronage dependent upon continued loyalty, the partisan system's most explicit manifestation was through the construction of housing schemes that were made available to people on the basis of party membership. These government-constructed properties came to constitute 40% or more of housing stock in downtown constituencies. And while the colonial government was involved in the construction of housing developments that solidified particular political allegiances in the aftermath of hurricanes and other disasters, and while the PNP had proposed a program of slum clearance just prior to independence in 1961, it was the removal of squatters from Western Kingston and the subsequent construction of Tivoli Gardens that solidified the links between housing, territory, and political party. In 1963, 932 families comprising over 3,600 people were removed from the Foreshore Road area in Western Kingston, and the destruction of their dwellings began on the 2nd of October to enable phase 1 of the Tivoli Gardens scheme. Additional evictions began in mid-February and continued through mid-July 1966, displacing about 2,000 people, and this led to the replacement of left-leaning back-a-wall with phases 2 and 3 of Tivoli Gardens. By mid-August, political gang warfare had surged, and in October, the Jamaica Labor Party declared a state of emergency that lasted until after the 1967 elections. Following the completion of Tivoli Gardens, which remains with Denhamtown, the Jamaica Labor Party stronghold in downtown Kingston, the PNP government constructed additional housing for its own supporters. The garrisonization of downtown Kingston was further reinforced by the abandonment of downtown spaces by Jamaican elites and middle-class professionals. So contemporary garrisons, of which Tivoli Gardens is considered the most perfect example, are thus territorially rooted, homogenous voting communities where political support is exchanged for contracts and other social welfare benefits. As in the past, these exchanges have been institutionalized and even codified as part of general procedures for the distribution of paid work and social services among constituencies downtown, with the votes benefits nexus mediated through the relationship between a politician and a local don. This relationship, however, has not been static. It became part of a more general ideological struggle during the 1970s, and it subsequently transformed as the elaboration of the transnational trades in cocaine and weapons supplanted a previously smaller trafficking of ganja. This has strengthened the role of the dons vis-a-vis the politicians, as dons' increasing involvement in both illicit and legitimate businesses has provided politicians with financial support, in addition to the militia-like support offered during election periods. This is also what has perpetuated a kind of permanent war in which Kingston figures centrally as a spatially, racially, and politically polarized place, both discursively and symbolically, and it's what has brought garrison dons to the attention of the US government. What were thus made legible with the Tivoli incursion in 2010 were the various scales at which and through which the garrison operates. In other words, the garrison doesn't merely denote a physical space, one that's simultaneously local, national, and global, but also evokes an affective disposition encompassing the requirement of submission to a set of dictating norms and forms of violence that include the suspension of critical consciousness, the simultaneous denigration of blackness and its celebration in popular culture, the violent policing of movement, and the need to appeal to a leader for the provision of basic requirements. This is why other modalities of organizing political life and social development, like Rastafari, or like the People's Freedom Movement or the Black Power movement, are seen and subdued as threats, not just to Jamaican sovereignty and U.S. hegemony, but also to the worldview that positions Black bodies as instruments of profit, both economic and political, for others. What undergirds my arguments here is the assertion that these contemporary manifestations of garrison politics are grounded in a system of political authority on sugar estates, oriented toward loyalty to a powerful figure and reliance upon that figure for work, benefits, and protection. There is, in other words, a certain kind of global historical priorness that we should attribute to political organization in New World societies, one that has to do with the infrastructures, practices, and processes of politics within post-colonial New World nation states in which the racialized category of Blackness must be understood as foundational to the experience of modern colonial and imperial sovereignty. We would do well to remember that in Jamaica and elsewhere, the consolidation of plantation-based rather than peasant-based agriculture only deepened with intensified penetration in the late 19th century by the United States. While in Puerto Rico, Cuba, and the Dominican Republic, plantations heralded an intensified investment in sugar, in Jamaica, it was banana production that became more vertically integrated into an export-oriented plantation system monopolized by the Boston Fruit Company, later to become the United Fruit Company, despite the origins of this industry in small-scale peasant production. Tensions regarding a deepening U.S. influence over the Jamaican economy extended to the political realm after the 1907 earthquake in Kingston, in the wake of which then Governor Swettenham was recalled to Britain because he refused the assistance of a contingent of U.S. Marines who had arrived on a rescue mission. By World War II, with the basis for Destroyers Agreement and in its aftermath with the establishment of the Anglo-Caribbean Commission, the United States had a significant foothold in Jamaican economic, political, and sociocultural life, and this foothold only deepened throughout the 20th century and into the 21st with the militarization of drug policy and the intensification of migration after the 1965 Immigration Naturalization Act. The U.S. was therefore fundamental to the reorganization of sovereignty in Jamaica after World War II, and intelligence gathering and labor mobilizing were the critical institutional spheres of this reorganization. I mention this here only in order to give a sense of the multiplicity of sovereignties within which Jamaicans are imbricated and to which Jamaicans have responded in different ways at different times. In Tivoli Gardens, certainly there have been multiple sovereignties at play, and the different scales at which they have operated, sometimes in collaboration and sometimes not, give us windows into the affective socio-political fields in which people attempt to make life. If we concede that seizing state power is both an act of self-determination and an act of sovereign violence, then we're able to grasp the inherently contradictory nature of revolution. And we're in a position to take seriously Maziki Thame's argument that, quote, the post-colonial experience produces violence that in and of itself is related to processes of liberation. Drawing from Anglophone Caribbean scholarship attending to the relevance of Fanon and his views of revolution to formerly British West Indian territories, Thame explores the gendered, racialized, and class dimensions of Caribbean nationalisms. Her argument is that within a configuration in which, quote, middle-class and professional men came to assume power over the nation and have maintained their dominance over other weaker men and over women in general, end quote, the Caribbean state became an agent of this subject position. The relationships between gendered, class, kinship norms, and nationalist respectability have been discussed elsewhere at length, but what's important here is Thame's contention that where full personhood and citizenship remain in question for Black working-class Jamaicans, working-class men have been criminalized and singled out for exceptional treatment by the Jamaican state. Violence against poor Jamaicans has thus become normalized, quote, as a feature of elite consensus around the establishment of a social order that rendered poor blacks also demeaned. The violence Thame is pinpointing is not only the violence of party politics and the racialized patterns of structural violence that have been normative throughout the Americas, but is also an everyday violence that permeates encounters with middle-class people, agents of the state, and each other. The garrison, for Thame, is an extension of this violence, and it's a, quote, symbol of conquest and specifically of middle-class dominance over the poor through the party mechanism, one that seeps into every other dimension of social organization and interaction locally and transnationally. Fanon's point about revolutionary violence is that it turns the norms of society on their head. It purges colonial degradation and allows for the reclamation of personhood and the realization of meaningful social and economic transformation. But what kind of liberation could Fanon's cleansing and humanizing violence bring within this context? One in which the response to alienation from the nationalist state has been violence, disorder, indiscipline, though not necessarily of a revolutionary nature. Thame points out that for many scholars, violence in post-colonial Jamaica has been an act of empowerment and a, quote, means to visibility. Through their competition and collaboration with the state in their use of violence, she writes, segments of the urban poor become empowered. Violence in this frame is a route to recognition, but one that has been primarily expressed and received or rejected through the very masculinism that undergirds the post-colonial state. Can this ultimately allow for the development of new political and ethical logics? Thame suggests that we need, quote, a new focus on the meaning of liberation, which seeks to deconstruct a decolonization steeped in men's desire for power and to simultaneously transform the, quote, institutions of alienation and domination that became features of the post-colonial state. Here is the crux of an important insight into why earlier models of political liberation have been exhausted. If we must confront what David Scott has argued over the past 2 decades is a crisis in the, quote, coherence of the secular modern project, then how do we contend with the limits of post-colonial sovereignty and its flawed models for political and social change? How might we critique the incompatibility of decoloniality and liberalism without falling into what Sylvia Wynter has called simplistic, easy radicalisms? Within anthropology, the critique of liberalism has tended to center on the liberalism of Locke, Kant, and other framers of Enlightenment-oriented modern state institutions that would ultimately come to operate through a focus on private property, market relations, and developmentalism. It has not typically turned its critical lens toward the romanticist strands of liberalism, perhaps because these are the strands that are more common fodder for anthropological research, the, quote, cargo cults and millennial movements, critical of abstract rationalism and capitalist modernity that we have striven to make legible given configurations of inequality. While we have deconstructed the utopias envisioned through these movements, we have respected them, even sometimes rescuing them from the sense that romanticism tends inescapably toward fascism, totalitarianism, and similar reactionary programs. A Weberian tradition of anti-Enlightenment romanticism, however, is one that's been central to many successful social transformation projects, including extremely conservative ones. In large measure because of the tendency toward charismatic leadership, which is not unique, of course, to Germanic traditions, but also, and possibly more so, because of the affective as opposed to rational secular force of these movements. The problem of revolution, then, should be reformulated in terms of an ongoing struggle between 2 versions of liberal social change, with the power of institutional transformation probably resting in the modern secular liberal revolutionary framework, and the power of affective attachment probably staying with the Germanic framework, in both its exclusionary and inclusive guises. If aspects of romanticism have been central to the contemporary rightward shifts throughout the Americas and Europe, they have also undergirded powerful social movements like Rastafari that have gone the furthest to critique the liberal capitalist status quo and the progressive teleologies of developmentalism. Why then have we not tended to imagine our own revolutionary futures through this lens? Michael Lowy and Robert Sayre have advocated for a reconsideration of Romanticism. In Romanticism Against the Tide of Modernity, they argue that the critical force and clarity of Romanticism lies in its exposure of the, quote, blindness of the ideologies of progress, the unthought of bourgeois thought. Their argument is that Romanticism can be both revolutionary and counter-revolutionary, undergirding movements with vastly discrepant ends. What is common to all, however, is a, quote, value on life, love, hope, freedom, and joy, as well as creativity, and a rejection of the Enlightenment's abstract rationalism, as well as the stultifying reification, defined here as, quote, the dehumanization of human life, the transforming of human relations into relations among things, inert objects, that accompanied the move to global capitalism. Where most would locate Romanticism as emerging in the wake of the French Revolution as the result of disillusionment with the bourgeoisie that seized power, Lowy and Sayre track it back to the early 18th century and an emergent disillusionment with the spread of capitalism. They argue that in pushing a critique of capitalist modernity, the Romantic view constitutes modernity's self-criticism. Throughout their text, Lowy and Sayre chart a typology of Romanticisms, differentiating between restitutionist, conservative, fascistic, resigned, reformist, and revolutionary and/or utopian Romanticisms, which for them would include Jacobin democratic Romanticism, and distinguishing further between the English, French, and German varieties of each. It is this last category of Romanticism that contains some interesting bedfellows. Marx and Engels appear among the utopian Romanticists, as well as Bukharin and Stalin, E.P. Thompson, and the Franklin School. Lowy and Sayre also argue that Surrealism was the 20th century movement that most, quote, brought the Romantic aspiration to re-enchant the world to the peak of its expression, and that most radically embodied Romanticism's revolutionary dimension, end quote. And of course, it was Surrealism and later Situationism that inspired Césaire and Fanon, in part because it was a way to rethink form, but also because it reimagined the relationships among past, present, and future, and it eschewed the binary dualisms of self, other, mind, body, etc. While Lowy and Sayre do not tether their grounding of Romanticism and anti-capitalism to imperialism and the colonization of the Americas at all, if we understand modernity as the ground upon which our degradation as non or not quite humans is realized, then we should be able to see the appeal and the purchase of an anti-modern philosophy and practice within settings characterized by colonization and plantation slavery. For Europeans, Romanticist nostalgia for the past and a desire to recreate a pre-capitalist human community was often reckoned through being harmoniously connected with nature. While this has been a strand within New World post-plantation movements, the desire for the recognition of personhood and Romanticism's critique of reification would perhaps be its more compelling dimensions. We might thus reframe the problem of contemporary revolution as an ongoing struggle between two versions of liberal social change, secular rational versus romanticist, or in other kind of language, pragmatists versus poets. In Jamaica, we could define this struggle for revolutionary social change as one between the progressive left, a formation that I would take to include the various Marxist and Black power groups that came to occupy the political landscape after universal suffrage in 1944, but perhaps more stridently in the late 1960s and throughout the 1970s, and the prophetic left, a formation that would encompass Rastafari, but also Ethiopianism and earlier redemptive religious movements like Bedouardism, as well as those secular prophetic hybrids like Garveyism. Of course, these two formations, especially during the late 1960s and the early 70s, did not exist within a nationalist vacuum and were not necessarily mutually exclusive. At particular moments and within particular contexts, there were significant points of overlap and sometimes collaboration between these two versions of revolution and social transformation. At other times, there were significant disconnects. Moreover, if the general difficulty of revolution is not the breaking of the old, but the institutionalizing of the new, then the difficulty of both forms of revolution in the Caribbean and the devastation attending their collapse has to do with the position of the region within a global political economy increasingly dominated by the US and now also Chinese economic interest. For the progressive left, the bourgeois rights achieved through liberal revolutions are important, meaningful, and deserving of a more profound elaboration through the strong and slow boring of hard boards, as Weber famously defined politics. This is an approach that, quote, criticizes the present in the name of certain modern values while calling on modernity to surpass itself, to accomplish its own evolution. And it is one that works from the messy and difficult here and now rather than envisioning a utopian past or future. It attempts to form alliances among the positions of actually existing people with all their actually existing flaws in order to produce actually existing change through control of the state. For them, romanticist movements are important, but cannot ultimately play a leading role on the stage of revolution. However, within our actually existing context, I would argue that it's romanticist movements that have consistently produced meaningful and lasting transformations in people's understanding of the world and their place in it, and therefore of their internal world and their intersubjective relations, in part because they don't recognize the boundaries of the territorial state. Theorizing sovereignty in relation to questions of affect then forces us to generate more complex accounts of the historical and social relations through which notions and experiences of sovereignty are produced, experienced, and circulated across time and space. And it encourages us to more fully appreciate the complexity of how visions of the present, the future, and social change are inhabited and expressed in extremely complex and often contradictory ways by people who are operating in networks that encompass many scales simultaneously. Let me return to Maziki Thame's claim that corruption, middle-class dominance, and the criminalization of Black working-class men and women in Jamaica can only be dismantled by displacing men's desire for power from the center of political thought and action. While Weberian conceptualizations of politics and revolution do much to help us take seriously the affective states that constitute notions of politics and community, it is true that they do not necessarily move us outside of the broader frame of masculinism. Neither, have we seen, does the secular rationalism of the progressive left. What Thame proposes is a kind of feminist solution, one that makes visible other kinds of struggle and action, typically led by women, that doesn't rely on charismatic leadership and that involves collaboration among diverse stakeholders. This is indeed her own program of research, and it's a critically important one. What I want to propose is another kind of feminist solution, not as an alternative, but as a way to walk alongside Thame. It's a solution that's grounded in Witnessing 2.0, that quotidian practice of watching, listening, and feeling that is relational and profoundly intersubjective. This solution is geared toward, one, taking seriously embodied affective ways of knowing in order to, two, track the long-term entanglements that have produced and sustained the binaries structuring our modern world so that we find ways to, three, undo dualistic modalities of thinking and acting in order to, four, generate more meaningful forms of repair. I ultimately argue that this repair must be generated through the real love of deep recognition, but that's the subject of another talk. So for now, let me conclude by stating that thinking sovereignty through affect speaks to the ethical impulses of this project and the questions that originally framed it. How are we complicit in the perpetuation of sovereign violence? To whom are we accountable? And what might real liberation feel like? Thank you.